The rain hammered against the stone walls of Windsor Castle that November morning. Inside the East Wing corridor, a single guard stood at his post, shoulders squared, eyes forward. His name was Thomas Whitmore, 73 years old. And he shouldn't have been there at all. Most men his age were spending mornings in garden chairs or walking grandchildren to school. But Thomas wore the dark uniform of the castle security detail, polished buttons catching the dim hallway light. His hands, weathered and scarred, rested steady at his sides. He had returned to this job 6 months ago, not because he needed the money, not because he was bored, but because of a promise made decades earlier to a young woman who would one day become queen. The corridor was silent except for the distant echo of footsteps. Thomas didn't move. He had learned long ago that patience was a guard's greatest weapon. He had learned it in the Royal Marines. He had learned it standing outside bedroom doors and conference rooms, protecting people whose names filled history books. The footsteps grew louder, heels clicking sharp against marble, then voices tight with irritation. "This is absurd," a woman's voice cut through the air. "I will not be kept waiting in some side corridor like a guest." Thomas recognized that voice immediately. Queen Consort Camilla, wife of King Charles. A woman who had spent years fighting for her place in the royal family, and who now expected every door to open before she arrived. If you're drawn into this story, stay with us. There's so much more to uncover. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. 2 royal aides appeared first, walking quickly, faces flushed. Behind them came Camilla herself, dressed in a charcoal coat, her expression sharp with frustration. She was scheduled to meet with the king in the private study, but the study was occupied. Protocol required her to wait. She didn't like waiting. "Excuse me," one of the aides said softly, approaching Thomas. "Her Majesty would like to proceed through to the king's study."
Oh.
Thomas didn't blink. His voice was calm, steady. "The study is in use. No one enters until the meeting concludes." The aide shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps. An exception could be made." "There's no exceptions," Thomas said. "Those are the standing orders." Camilla stepped forward, eyes narrowing. She was not accustomed to being told no, especially not by a guard old enough to be a museum exhibit. "Do you know who I am?" Her voice was cold, controlled, but anger flickered beneath it. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied. His tone was respectful, but firm. "And I know my orders. No one enters." For a moment, silence filled the corridor. The aides exchanged nervous glances. Rain continued to batter the windows. Camilla's jaw tightened. She took another step closer. Her eyes locked on Thomas. "I could have you removed from this post with a single phone call." Thomas met her gaze without flinching. "That may be true, ma'am, but until that call is made, I follow my orders." Something flickered across Camilla's face. Not just anger now. Something deeper. Confusion, maybe, or recognition. She stared at Thomas, as if trying to place him, as if some distant memory was clawing its way to the surface. "Have we met before?" she asked, voice quieter now, suspicious. Thomas didn't answer right away. His eyes shifted, just for a second, toward a painting on the wall. A portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, young and radiant, painted decades ago. Once he said finally, "A long time ago." Camilla's expression changed. The anger faded, replaced by something colder. Realization, perhaps? Fear? She turned sharply on her heel and walked away, heels echoing down the corridor like gunshots. The aides hurried after her, whispering frantically. Thomas remained at his post, alone again, silent. But his heart was pounding, because that look in Camilla's eyes told him everything, she remembered. And she knew exactly who he was. Asterisk. Thomas stood alone in the corridor for another 20 minutes before the study doors opened. A group of officials filed out, nodding politely as they passed. He waited until the corridor was empty, then finally allowed himself to breathe. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from memory. That evening, Thomas sat in his small flat on the edge of Windsor town. The place was neat, almost military in its precision. A single armchair, table, Photos on the wall, all carefully framed. Most of them were old, faded at the edges. One photo stood out, black and white, creased down the middle. A young man in Marine uniform stood beside a young woman in a simple dress. She was smiling, genuinely smiling, the kind of smile that didn't appear in official portraits. The young man looked proud, protective. That young woman was Princess Elizabeth. The young man was Thomas Whitmore, 22 years old. Assigned to her security detail in 1952, just weeks before she became queen, he poured himself tea and sat down, the memory flooding back like it had happened yesterday. It was February 1952. King George VI had just died. Elizabeth, only 25, was thrust onto the throne, grief-stricken and overwhelmed. The world watched her every move. The press circled like vultures, and inside the palace walls, threats were everywhere. There had been letters, anonymous, cruel, some threatening violence. Security was tightened. Thomas, fresh from military service, was assigned to the princess's personal detail. He remembered the first time he stood outside her private chambers. She had opened the door herself, startling him. She looked exhausted, eyes red from crying. "You're new," she had said softly. "Yes, ma'am." "Thomas Whitmore." She studied him for a moment. "You were in the Marines?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you've seen terrible things?" He hesitated. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded slowly. "So have I. My father died in his sleep 2 weeks ago." "I wasn't there." "I was in Kenya, climbing trees and watching animals, while he took his last breath." Her voice cracked. "They didn't even tell me right away. I found out hours later." Thomas didn't know what to say. Protocol said to stay silent. But something in her voice, the raw pain in it, broke through his training. "Grief doesn't follow a schedule, ma'am," he said quietly, "and duty doesn't erase it. You'll carry both. That's the burden of who you are." Elizabeth looked at him, surprised. Then something softened in her expression. "Thank you, Thomas." From that day forward, she trusted him. Not just as a guard, but as someone who saw her as a person, not just a crown. Over the following months, Thomas became part of her inner circle. He stood outside rooms where decisions were made that shaped nations. He walked beside her through gardens when she needed air. He was there the day she was coronated, standing in the shadows, watching her carry the weight of an empire on her shoulders. And he was there the night someone tried to kill her. It was late, nearly midnight. Thomas was doing rounds in the palace when he heard a sound. A window sliding open where it shouldn't be. He moved quickly, silently, following the noise to a service corridor near the Queen's private quarters. A man stood in the shadows, dressed in black, a blade glinting in his hand. Thomas didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, slamming the intruder against the wall. The knife clattered to the floor. They fought, brutal and fast. Thomas took a slash across his forearm, blood soaking his sleeve. But he didn't stop. He drove his fist into the man's jaw, then again, till the intruder collapsed. Security flooded the corridor moments later. The Queen appeared at her door, pale but composed. "Thomas," she said, seeing the blood. "You're hurt." "I'm fine, ma'am." She stepped closer, her hand gently touching his arm. "You saved my life." He shook his head. "I did my job." "No," she said firmly. "You did more than that." Later that night, after the wound was stitched and the intruder taken away, Elizabeth summoned Thomas to her study. She handed him a small pin, a personal emblem, something not recorded in any official ceremony. "I will never forget what you did tonight," she said. "And I need you to make me a promise." "Anything, ma'am?" "If I ever need you again, if this family ever needs you, you will come back. No matter how much time has passed, no matter what has changed, you will stand your post." Thomas looked into her eyes and saw something rare. Vulnerability. Trust. Promise. He said. He kept that pin for over 70 years, and 6 months ago, when he received a letter, unsigned but written in a hand he recognized, he knew it was time to return. Asterisk, the letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning in May. Plain envelope, no return address. Inside, a single handwritten note. "Thomas, the family needs you again. Not for ceremony. For protection, there are forces at work that threaten what my mother built. I cannot say more in writing, but if you remember your promise, come back. Stand your post one last time. It wasn't signed. But Thomas knew the handwriting. He had seen it on Christmas cards, on personal notes slipped to loyal staff over the decades. It was Princess Anne, the Queen's daughter. Elizabeth had died 8 months earlier. The world had mourned. But inside the palace walls, something else was happening. A shift. A quiet war over legacy, over influence, over what the monarchy would become. Thomas knew why Anne had called him back. Because someone needed to remember. Someone needed to stand firm when others would bend. He reported for duty the following week. Most of the staff didn't question it. An old veteran returning for one final tour. Sentimental, perhaps, but harmless. But Thomas wasn't there for sentiment. He was there because he had made a promise to a queen, and because he knew what she had feared most in her final years. Not scandal, not the press, but the erosion of everything she had sacrificed her life to protect. The day after his confrontation with Camilla, Thomas was summoned to an office in the castle's north wing. The room was small, windowless, lit by a single lamp. A man sat behind the desk, 50s, sharp suit, eyes like a predator. His name was Gerald Harcourt, head of palace communications. A man who had risen quickly after Charles became king, brought in to modernize the monarchy's image. "Mr. Whitmore," Gerald said, not standing, not offering a handshake. "Please sit." Thomas remained standing. "I prefer not to, sir." Gerald smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Suit yourself. I'll be brief. Yesterday's incident with Her Majesty the Queen Consort has been brought to my attention. I followed protocol," Thomas said evenly. "Protocol." Gerald leaned back in his chair. "Yes, well, protocol is one thing. Discretion is another. Her Majesty felt disrespected. I showed her the same respect I show everyone. I followed my orders. Your orders." Gerald's smile faded. "Let me explain something to you, Mr. Whitmore. This is not Queen Elizabeth's palace anymore. Times have changed. The people who give orders have changed. And frankly, your presence here is irregular." Thomas said nothing. He had dealt with men like Gerald before. Men who mistook titles for power, who thought intimidation was leadership. "I've reviewed your file," Gerald continued. "Quite a career. Royal Marines, Palace Security, retired in 1989. You should be enjoying your golden years. Instead, you're here, playing soldier at 73. Why?" "I was asked to return," Thomas said simply. "By whom?" "That's not your concern, sir." Gerald's jaw tightened. "Everything in this palace is my concern. I manage the image, the narrative, the flow of information. And right now, you're a complication. I'm doing my job. Your job." Gerald stood now, walking around the desk. "Your job is to stand where you're told and keep your mouth shut. Your job is not to antagonize members of the royal family. Do you understand me?" Thomas met his gaze without flinching. "I understand you perfectly, sir." For a moment the room was silent. Gerald studied Thomas, searching for weakness, for fear. He found neither. "There are people who want you gone," Gerald said quietly. "People with influence. I suggest you don't give them more reasons. Is that all, sir?" Gerald's eyes narrowed. "For now," Thomas turned and walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft click. But as he walked down the corridor, his mind was racing. Gerald's words weren't just a warning. They were a confirmation. Someone was threatened by his presence. Someone who understood what he represented. A connection to Elizabeth. A memory of what the monarchy used to stand for. That evening, Thomas received a visitor. He was in the staff quarters polishing his uniform when there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find a woman in her 60s, elegant, wearing a simple coat. Princess Anne, the Queen's only daughter. "May I come in?" she asked softly. Thomas stepped aside and entered, glancing around the small room before turning to face him. "I heard about yesterday," she said. "With Camilla?" "I followed protocol, ma'am." "I know you did." Anne's voice was tired. That's why you're here. Because you still remember what that means. She sat down in the single chair, and for a moment she looked just like her mother. The same strength in her eyes. The same weight on her shoulders. My mother trusted you, Anne said. More than almost anyone. She told me once that you were the only person who ever saw her as Elizabeth, not just the Queen. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest. She was the finest person I ever knew, ma'am, she was. Anne's voice cracked slightly. And everything she built is being torn apart. By whom? Anne looked up at him, and in her eyes, Thomas saw something he hadn't expected. Fear. By people who want the monarchy to survive, she said, but not the way my mother envisioned it. They want popularity. They want relevance. They want to erase the past and build something new. And Camilla. Anne hesitated. Camilla wants to be remembered as a queen. Not a mistress. Not a scandal. She wants history to be rewritten. And anyone who remembers the old history is in her way. Thomas understood now. The confrontation hadn't been about protocol. It had been about memory. About a guard who had stood beside Elizabeth, who had protected her, who represented everything Camilla could never be. What do you need me to do? Thomas asked. Anne stood, walking to the window. Rain was falling again, streaking the glass. Stand your post, she said quietly. Remember your promise. And whatever happens, don't let them forget who she was. Asterisk the following week, tensions inside Windsor Castle reached a breaking point. It started with small things. Thomas's shift assignments changed without notice. He was moved from the East Wing, where the king held private meetings, to outer corridors with little traffic. His security clearance was quietly downgraded. Doors that had once opened for him now remained. Locked, someone was pushing him out. Slowly, carefully, but unmistakably. Thomas didn't complain. He showed up for every shift, stood at every post, followed every order. But he watched. He listened. And he began to piece together what was really happening. Camilla was redecorating. Not just rooms, but history. Portraits were being moved. Ones featuring Elizabeth in her prime, showing her strength and dignity, were replaced with modern art or photographs of Charles and Camilla. Personal items that had belonged to the late Queen, small touches that made the palace feel like her home, were being quietly removed and placed in storage. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't notice. But Thomas noticed. Because he remembered how Elizabeth had arranged those rooms herself. How she had chosen each painting, each piece of furniture. With care, she had once told him, "These walls hold memory, Thomas. Long after we're gone, they'll tell our story. We must be careful what story we leave behind." Now that story was being erased. One afternoon, Thomas was standing outside a storage room in the palace basement. He wasn't supposed to be there. His shift had ended an hour ago. But he had followed a truck earlier that day, watched as workers loaded items from the Queen's private study. He slipped inside the storage room when no one was looking. The room was dim, filled with boxes and furniture covered in white sheets. Thomas moved through it slowly, pulling back sheets, opening boxes. His heart sank with each discovery. Elizabeth's personal correspondence, photo albums from her childhood, the desk where she had written her Christmas broadcasts for over 50 years, a painting of her with her corgis, one she had loved, hung in her bedroom for decades, all of it hidden away. Erased. Thomas found one box labeled simply "Personal Effects." He opened it carefully. Inside were letters, handwritten, tied with ribbon. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Elizabeth's. He pulled out one letter, hands trembling. It was addressed to no one, dated just 3 months before she died. "I fear what will come after I'm gone," it read. "Not for myself, but for what we fought to protect. The dignity, the duty, the sacrifice. There are those who believe the monarchy must change to survive. Perhaps they're right. But in changing, we must not forget who we were. We must not erase the people who gave everything to this crown." Thomas closed his eyes, the letter trembling in his hands. She had known. In her final months, she had seen what was coming. Put that down. Thomas spun around. Gerald Harcourt stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 security officers. "This is a restricted area," Gerald said coldly. "You have no authorization to be here." Thomas carefully placed the letter back in the box. "I was curious where the Queen's belongings had gone." "The late Queen's belongings are being preserved," Gerald said. "In proper storage? Away from public display." "You mean hidden?" Thomas said quietly. Gerald's expression hardened. "I mean protected. From people who would exploit them for sentiment and nostalgia. This palace is moving forward, Mr. Whitmore. Perhaps you should too." The security officer stepped forward. Thomas didn't resist. He walked past Gerald, out of the storage room, back toward the light. But as he passed, Gerald spoke again. "You're being reassigned. Effective immediately. No more interior posts. You'll be stationed at the outer gates. Ceremonial duty only." Thomas stopped. "On whose authority?" "Mine. Approved by Her Majesty the Queen Consort." There it was. Camilla's hand, moving the pieces, pushing him further away from the center, from the truth. "Very well, sir," Thomas said. He walked away, leaving Gerald standing in the shadows. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat in his flat, staring at the old photograph of him and Elizabeth. She looked so young in that picture, so full of hope. He thought about giving up, about walking away. He was 73. He had served his time. He had kept his promise. But then he remembered her voice. Not the Queen's voice, the one she used for speeches and ceremonies, but Elizabeth's voice, the one she used late at night when she was tired and human. "Thank you for seeing me, Thomas. Not the crown. Me." He couldn't walk away. Not yet. The next morning, Thomas reported to the outer gates as ordered. The post was simple, almost meaningless. He stood at attention while tourists took photos, while cars passed in and out. No decisions were made here. No history happened here, but Thomas stayed alert, because he knew something Gerald and Camilla didn't. A promise made to a queen doesn't end with her death. It echoes forward, through time, through memory, through the people who refuse to forget. And Thomas Whitmore had never broken a promise. 3 days later, something happened that changed everything. A journalist arrived at Windsor Castle, requesting access to the royal archives. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, an investigative reporter known for exposing corruption. She had been researching the monarchy's financial dealings, looking for inconsistencies. She had found something big. Documents had surfaced suggesting that certain royal assets, items belonging personally to Queen Elizabeth, were being quietly sold to private collectors. Not officially, not publicly, but through back channels, with the proceeds going to undisclosed accounts. Someone was profiting from the Queen's legacy. Someone with access and authority. The palace denied everything. Gerald Harcourt gave a press statement calling the allegations baseless and offensive. But Sarah Mitchell didn't back down. She demanded an independent investigation. She demanded transparency. And she demanded to speak with staff members who had served under Elizabeth, people who would know what had been in her personal collection. Thomas's name was on that list. That evening he received a phone call. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Whitmore." A woman's voice, steady and professional. "Yes. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm a journalist. I believe we need to talk." Thomas met Sarah Mitchell 2 days later in a small cafe outside Windsor. It was early morning, the place nearly empty. Sarah sat in the corner booth, laptop open, files spread across the table. She was younger than Thomas expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and an intensity that reminded him of Elizabeth. Not in appearance, but in purpose. Both women who refused to look away from difficult truths. "Thank you for meeting me," Sarah said as Thomas sat down. "I know this isn't easy. What exactly do you want to know?" Thomas asked. Sarah slid a photograph across the table. It showed a painting, ornate frame, royal insignia in the corner. "Do you recognize this?" Thomas's chest tightened. Yes, it hung in the Queen's private study. A gift from her father, King George, just before he died. According to palace records, this painting is in storage, Sarah said. Protected. Preserved for historical purposes. She slid another document across the table. An auction receipt dated 3 months ago. The painting had been sold to a private collector in Monaco for £800,000. It's not in storage, Sarah said quietly. It's gone. Thomas stared at the receipt, anger building in his chest. Who authorized the sale? That's what I'm trying to find out. Sarah opened her laptop, showing him a spreadsheet. Over the past 6 months, at least 20 items from Queen Elizabeth's personal collection have been sold. Paintings, jewelry, furniture, historical documents. The total value is over £12 million. And the money? Disappeared into private accounts. Offshore entities. Shell companies. Sarah leaned forward. Someone with authority is systematically looting the Queen's legacy, and they're hiding it behind palace bureaucracy. Thomas felt sick. Elizabeth had spent 70 years building that legacy. Every item, every piece of history, chosen carefully, meant to tell the story of duty and sacrifice. Now it was being sold off like garage sale leftovers. Why are you telling me this? Thomas asked. Because you knew her, Sarah said. You were there. You can testify to what those items meant, where they belonged. Without that testimony, this is just paperwork. Numbers. But with your voice, it becomes theft. Betrayal. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. He knew what Sarah was asking. To speak publicly, to accuse members of the royal family, to break decades of loyal silence. If I do this, he said slowly, they'll destroy me. My reputation. My service record. They'll paint me as a bitter old man chasing attention, probably, Sarah said. But they won't be able to erase the truth. And that's what matters, isn't it? The truth. Thomas looked at the photograph of the painting again. He remembered the day Elizabeth had shown it to him, tears in her eyes, telling him about her father's final words. Be strong, Lilibet. Stronger than you think you can be. She had been strong. For 70 years, she had carried the weight of a nation, never complaining, never faltering. The least he could do was speak the truth. I'll testify, Thomas said. Whatever you need. Sarah nodded, relief crossing her face. Thank you. I'll need you to sign a statement. Verify the items. Confirm their significance. It won't be easy. They'll fight back. Let them fight, Thomas said quietly. That afternoon, Thomas returned to Windsor Castle for his shift. But something was different. The moment he walked through the gates, he felt eyes on him. Staff members who usually nodded in greeting looked away. Security officers watched him closely. Someone had talked. Someone knew. Thomas took his post at the outer gate, standing at attention. The hours passed slowly. Tourists came and went. Cars rolled through. Everything appeared normal, but Thomas could feel the storm building. At 4 o'clock, Gerald Harcourt appeared. He walked directly to Thomas, 2 security officers trailing behind him. Mr. Whitmore, Gerald said, voice cold and formal. You're being relieved of duty. Effective immediately. On what grounds? Thomas asked. Violation of confidentiality agreements. Contact with unauthorized press. Conduct unbecoming of palace staff. Thomas felt a flash of anger, but kept his voice steady. I've violated nothing. I've told the truth. Your truth, Gerald said, is damaging to this institution. You were entrusted with the privilege of serving here, and you've betrayed that trust. I made a promise to Queen Elizabeth, Thomas said, his voice rising now, to protect what she built. That's what I'm doing. Queen Elizabeth is dead, Gerald said sharply. This is King Charles's palace now, and you no longer have a place in it. The security officers stepped forward. Thomas didn't resist. He removed his uniform badge, his identification, and handed them over. You'll receive your final pay within the week, Gerald said. You're not to return to palace grounds. If you do, you'll be arrested for trespassing. Thomas looked at Gerald for a long moment. History will remember what's happening here. Not the way you want, but the way it actually happened. History, Gerald said with a cold smile, is written by those who remain. Not by disgraced old guards. Thomas turned and walked away. The security officers followed him to the gates, watching as he left the castle grounds for the last time. But as Thomas walked down the road, his phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. Don't stop fighting. We're with you. A friend of the Queen. Thomas stopped walking. He read the message again. A friend of the Queen? It could be anyone. Anne, a loyal staff member. Someone who remembered. He looked back at Windsor Castle. Its ancient stones dark against the afternoon sky. This wasn't over. Not by a long way. That evening, Sarah Mitchell published her investigation. The article went viral within hours. Photos of the missing items, auction receipts, financial trails leading to offshore accounts, and at the center of it all, a quote from Thomas Whitmore, 73-year-old veteran guard who had served Queen Elizabeth for decades. She gave her life to this crown. She deserved better than to have her legacy sold off like unwanted furniture. We all deserve better. The palace issued an immediate denial. They called the allegations false. They called Thomas unreliable, a disgruntled former employee. But the public wasn't convinced. Social media exploded with support for Thomas. Hashtags trended. People demanded answers, and in a private room inside Windsor Castle, Camilla read the article with shaking hands, rage building in her chest. Thomas Whitmore had declared war, and she intended to win it. The backlash came swiftly and brutally. Within 24 hours of the article's publication, tabloids ran hit pieces on Thomas. Bitter guard invents scandal, palace insider, Whitmore known for instability, former employee's desperate grab for attention. Photos of Thomas from decades ago were dug up and twisted. A bar fight from his Marine days. A complaint filed by a junior officer in 1987 over a disagreement about protocol. Nothing serious, nothing that had impacted his career. But now, splashed across headlines, it painted him as violent, unreliable, unstable. Thomas watched it happen from his small flat. He didn't respond. He didn't defend himself. He had said what needed to be said. The rest was noise, but the attacks took their toll. Old friends stopped calling. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Someone spray-painted "Lure" across his front door. Sarah Mitchell called daily. "Are you okay? Do you need protection?" "I'm fine," Thomas said each time. And he was, because he had lived through worse. He had faced enemy fire. He had stood in the darkness protecting a young queen from a knife in the shadows. This was just words. Words couldn't kill him, but they could bury the truth. 1 week after the article, Palace announced an internal investigation. Independent auditors would review all transactions involving royal assets. Results would be made public within 3 months. It sounded promising, but Thomas knew better. 3 months was enough time to hide evidence, to create paperwork trails that led nowhere, to ensure that whoever was responsible would never be found, unless someone on the inside spoke up that night. Thomas received a visitor. He opened his door to find Princess Anne standing in the rain, coat pulled tight, no security, no assistance. Just her. "May I come in?" She asked. Thomas stepped aside and entered, water dripping from her coat onto his floor. She looked exhausted, older than her years. "They're trying to bury you," she said without preamble. "Camilla Gerald, the new guard? They want you discredited, silenced, forgotten." "I know," Thomas said. "I can't protect you," Anne said, and her voice cracked. "I've tried. I've spoken to Charles, 2 advisors, to anyone who will listen. But they won't hear it. They're convinced you're the problem, not the solution." "You don't need to protect me, ma'am," Thomas said gently. "I can take care of myself." Anne looked at him, tears forming in her eyes. "My mother trusted you, more than almost anyone. And now they're destroying you for trying to honor her memory." Thomas stepped closer. "Your mother told me once that duty means doing what's right, even when it costs you everything. She lived that truth every day. I'm just following her example." Anne wiped her eyes, regaining composure. "There's something you should know. The internal investigation. It's a sham. The auditors have already been instructed on what to find. Nothing. They'll report that all transactions were legitimate, properly authorized, above board. How do you know? Because I've seen the draft report, Anne said quietly. Someone leaked it to me. Someone who still believes in accountability. She pulled a folder from inside her coat and handed it to Thomas. This is evidence. Real evidence. Financial records, emails, authorization signatures. It proves that items were sold without proper oversight, that money was diverted, that laws were broken. Thomas opened the folder, scanning the documents. His hands began to shake. Bank transfers. Signature approvals from high-level officials. And at the center of it all, one name appearing again and again. Gerald Harcourt. He's been skimming, Anne said. Using his position to authorize sales, pocketing portions of the proceeds through shell companies, and he's been doing it with Camilla's implicit approval. She wanted the items gone, the past erased. She didn't ask questions about where the money went. Why are you showing me this? Thomas asked. Because you're the only one brave enough to use it, Anne said. I can't. If I go public, it will tear the monarchy apart. Charles will be destroyed. The institution my mother gave her life to will collapse. Ow. And if I go public, you're already destroyed, Anne said bluntly. They've made sure of that. But you can still expose the truth. You can still make them answer for what they've done. Thomas looked at the documents again. This was it. The smoking gun. Proof of corruption at the highest levels, but using it would mean crossing a line. Not just criticizing the palace, but accusing them of crimes. It would mean investigations, arrests, possibly prison time for people who wore crowns. What would your mother want? Thomas asked quietly. Anne smiled sadly. She'd want the truth. Always the truth. No matter the cost. Thomas nodded. Then that's what she'll get. The next day, Thomas delivered the documents to Sarah Mitchell. She examined them carefully, verified their authenticity, consulted with lawyers. Then she published a second article. This one had names, numbers, evidence. The response was explosive, within hours. The story dominated every news channel. Calls for resignations. Demands for criminal investigations. Protests outside palace gates. Gerald Harcourt was suspended pending review. 2 other officials were placed on leave. And Camilla, for the first time since becoming queen consort, faced serious questions about her judgment and oversight. Thomas watched it unfold from his flat. No satisfaction. No vindication. Just a quiet sense of completion. He had kept his promise. 2 weeks later, Thomas received a letter. Hand-delivered, royal seal on the envelope. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Mr. Whitmore, on behalf of King Charles and the royal family, we offer our sincere apologies. An independent investigation has confirmed your allegations. Steps are being taken to recover missing assets and ensure accountability. Your service to Queen Elizabeth II and to this nation is recognized and honored. With gratitude and respect, wasn't signed. But Thomas didn't need a signature. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer beside the old photograph of him and Elizabeth. That evening, Thomas took a walk. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing. He walked to Windsor Castle and stood outside the gates. Looking up at the ancient stones, somewhere inside those walls, Elizabeth's portrait still hung. Her legacy still lived, not in paintings or furniture or jewelry, but in the memory of people who had known her, who had loved her, who refused to let her be erased. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out the small pin she had given him decades ago. The personal emblem, worn and faded now. He held it in his palm, feeling its weight. I kept my promise, he whispered. The wind picked up, rustling the trees. And for just a moment, Thomas could have sworn he heard her voice. Thank you, Thomas. Well done, good and faithful servant. He smiled. Then he turned and walked home, leaving the castle behind. His duty was complete. His promise was kept. And Elizabeth's legacy would not be forgotten, Not while people like Thomas Whitmore still drew breath, not while the truth still mattered, not ever.